When it comes to openings, the London system with the white pieces has served me well since I started playing chess 2 years ago. As I got into a more advanced rating range, I started to see fewer opening mistakes and more opportunities to play the fun lines of theory that I was studying. In this video, we'll be going over some games I played, starting when my chess.com rapid rating was around 1500 and ending with the game that got me to 2000. Now, chess isn't all about openings. You need to be making logical decisions and calculations while you're playing and analyze your own game data to improve. And there's a free and easy way to learn about logic and data, and that's the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the best way to learn things like math, data science, and computer science interactively. Wait, so I just drag it? What? Oh, okay, 11,000? There are thousands of lessons covering basic to advanced topics. The studio is aiming for a fall release. Well, don't do it. You're gonna get terrible numbers, dude. It's all very customizable to fit your needs and lets you work at your own pace. Whoa, 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 whoa. It has to be horror, right? You can try Brilliant free for 30 days at brilliant.org/Kamryn. The first 200 signups will get 20% off their annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/Kamryn. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back into the most brilliant opening for the white pieces, the London system. So a lot of people think of the London as a very setup-based opening, which it kind of is, and you can really use it that way at the lower levels. But once you get into the more advanced territory, you sort of have to know what you're doing against different kinds of moves that black will play. And that can mean deviating away from the typical plan of creating the pawn pyramid and just developing our pieces a little bit more naturally and actually going after black's position right from the start. And one perfect example of this is when we're playing against the king's Indian defense. So we start with the move d4, black brings their knight out and we bring our bishop out to f4. This is the typical London stuff. And the first move where we kind of deviate is we bring our knight out to c3. So this is more the Jobava setup, and you can play this as a London player normally if you want to sort of switch up your London a little bit, and it generally has different plans. I don't usually like to go for this setup because I usually like to do something else with my c-pawn and not have it be blocked in. But in this particular opening, it works really well. This knight is really nicely placed here, and we'll see why in just a little bit. It allows us to very quickly castle queenside and immediately go for the attack. We can push the e-pawn right into the center. That's normally not a move we're even allowed to play in the London because usually black will meet d4 with d5. But in this case, especially with the king's Indian, they're actually going to move the pawn to d6. And we can quickly go after the king side. We can push down the center. There's a lot more options here, and we can get an attack going right away. So in this game, black continued by fianchettoing the bishop. I pushed e4 right in the center. And if black doesn't play this e6 move right away and instead castles, this is often a mistake made at lower levels and also just in like shorter time controls. We can even push e5, kicking the knight out right away and just creating this massive center that black's going to have to deal with. But my opponent played the right move, blocking this pawn from pushing forward and attacking the knight, which technically we still can do, but these pawns are so strong right here in the center that we don't want to push them forward unnecessarily. We also don't want to trade and then have to trade off our queens because the queen is going to be a very important piece in the attack that we're about to create. So I moved my queen up. This is very important to put it on this square, lining up with the bishop so that we can trade off black's best piece, which is this fianchettoed bishop here on g7, just slicing into the position. And if we can trade that off as soon as possible, that will really help us. That's also why our e-pawn is on e4 instead of on e3 as it normally is in the London, because it's opening up for this queen and bishop battery, and if it's on e3, well, we couldn't go and trade off the bishop right away. Black castled, and I immediately went for this plan of trading off the bishop. It's a little bit inaccurate because it actually allows black to play the move that they played, which was c5. If I had instead castled on the previous move, this would have prevented c5 because if we take, we're just winning a pawn. Black cannot take because after all these trades, we are winning so much material. Black's in check and is going to lose the bishop, and we can also come up here and like threaten checkmate, and it's just a huge old mess. But going back to the actual game, I just captured the bishop, black took back, and I developed my knight to f3. Black took the d-pawn, I captured back with that knight. Black brought out their knight to c6, and I could have done a few things here. There's, it's a pretty equal game. There's multiple options. I decided to castle, just get my king to safety. It is important to note too, with opposite side castling, a lot of times it's a race just to see who can push their pawns or get their pieces to the other side of the board to attack the other person's king first. So black brought their queen out to b6, I captured the knight, black captured back with the pawn, opening up this file potentially for the rook to come in. And this is where I went for the sort of typical plan that I like to do in these kinds of positions, which is just shoving the h-pawn all the way up the board. Even if you end up sacrificing this h-pawn, it usually is such a overwhelming attack that it's hard for black to stop, because if this h-pawn goes away, the file is opened up for the rook, the queen is also aimed over here, and we have more pawns that we can start pushing all the way up the board, get the pieces out, and potentially go for a very quick checkmate. So black brought the rook over. It's also important to make sure you're not, blundering some kind of mate. You also have to play defensively in these kinds of positions. I pushed the b-pawn, just preventing the checkmate on b2. And now black goes for a similar plan of pushing their a-pawn all the way down the board. Basically the same idea on both sides, just breaking apart the protection around our castled kings. So in order to stop this continued a-pawn push, I moved my knight to the side of the board. Not the most accurate move, but it's also attacking the queen, so it's okay. Moving this knight also removed the protection of the e-pawn, which black took, but this is actually kind of a mistake, because if you calculate all the way through, this knight's going to get trapped, and black is not going to have enough compensation for it. So after I took the queen on b6, black took my queen on d2, I took the bishop, black took the bishop, and this is where the real mistake happens, right? Black probably on the previous move should have just taken the knight, and then I would have taken the knight. But now we've gone even further down this trading rabbit hole, and black's knight is just trapped down here. I get my knight out with this jump to e7, grabbing a pawn, and so we're equal on the material, but now black's knight is just trapped here. There's no squares for the knight to go where it won't be captured. So black pushed the a-pawn again, and this knight isn't going anywhere, and so I decided to grab another pawn and attack the rook. Black counterattacks my knight, but I actually am able to get mine to safety, and now the knight is truly trapped. After captures, black brings the rook down. I do have this escape square here as long as I can get rid of the knight's protection, which I finally did by taking the knight. And already I'm up so much material that as long as I hold on to my pieces, it's pretty difficult to lose this. But a few moves later, black lined up their rooks, and I essentially forced the rook trade. And because these passed pawns are so dangerous and black's never going to be able to get their king over there in time, I'm up a knight. Just impossible to win, so my opponent resigned. So that's one example where I had learned by this point in my chess journey where it was actually good to switch up the basic setup of the London and go for something a little bit more aggressive. So moving into our next game, this kind of setup is something you'll see at all levels, just a copycat variation of the London. And this can go a lot farther than it did in this game. Black can continue to mirror exactly what you're doing for quite a few moves before it becomes too difficult to keep it up. But essentially what you want to do is break the symmetry as soon as possible. So black is sort of doing a reverse London, making this pawn pyramid on the other side of the board. And this is where I decided to break the symmetry and go for c4. This is often a move you can play when you see that black's light-squared bishop has left its home square, where it's no longer protecting b7. Black brings out their bishop, I rocked it back, and then black brought their knight out to e7. This is a very strange square for a knight. I'm not exactly sure what the deal is here or what the plan is, if they're trying to go over here or what exactly is going on here. Normally the knight, of course, comes out to f6. Then I brought my queen out to b3, attacking the b7 pawn, which black's actually going to have kind of a hard time defending. Usually in these kinds of positions, black is able to bring their queen out to b6 and sort of counter this whole threat, and whichever person has a pawn on c4 for white or c5 for black can actually push the pawn, force the queen trade, and these doubled pawns are actually not so bad. We can push them up the board. It gives us a very simple plan to go for in the early middle game, and it gives us a lot of control over these files. It's just a very nice plan to play. But in this case, black actually can't do that because the bishop is being defended by the queen. So if the queen moves away, well, we can just take the bishop for free. So instead, black just pushes the b-pawn to protect it. And this is fine too. It's slightly weakening, but it's not anything really worth noting. I developed my knight, and then this is where black made a mistake. Again, remember, the queen is protecting this bishop, and now it's also given the job of protecting the b pawn. So this is called an overloaded piece, an overloaded queen. And if we take one of the pieces, then when black recaptures, we can take the other one. So that's why bishop d3 is a miss. Instead, it would have been better to capture the bishop, and then once the queen captures back, we will win the b pawn. But the game goes on. Black pushed a4, getting really aggressive with these pawns here. I dropped my queen back, now attacking the bishop twice. Black also rocked their bishop back, and then I ended up jumping my knight into the middle. This is usually a great square for the knight to be on in the London. Black decided to relieve the tension, and we had some trades. First here, and then black took on d3. And then my opponent seemed to really like using his pawns to sort of push my pieces back, and this can work in some kinds of positions, but in this case, it just seems to be generally weakening. Black developed their other knight to d7. These knights look just so funny right here. This is not typically where they go, and they don't really have a lot of prospects on this side of the board. This knight is a little bit more so active, but in both cases, this is not usually where you want to put your knights. I castled, black castled, and then I'm so shocked at myself that I was able to keep the tension with both of these pawns. Usually it's so tempting when you have this tension between the pawns for so long to actually trade one of them off and just relieve the tension and get rid of it. But this is actually really good because if I were to take, black would be able to actually activate their knight and get it onto a much nicer square. And so it's actually great to keep this tension and then just strike again at the center of the board. This might leave us with an isolated d-pawn, but that's okay because our pieces are just really active here. Now, I won't go too much further into this game. I did eventually relieve some of the tension here, but as you'll see a little bit further into the game, this pawn push was actually kind of a problem for black because it opened up this diagonal, and where you can be checked is where tactics happen. And so a little bit later, we have some more pawn trades. I had to move my queen because it's being attacked, and then we're attacked again. My main plan here was just to get some kind of a check on this king, and black just happened to play right into my hands here, putting the rook here, and now the very simple win is to give the check, and it's also a fork because we're attacking the undefended rook. So I think the key takeaway here really is just patience and taking advantage of the weaknesses that your opponent is creating. And black was actually doing a great job of creating weaknesses for himself. I didn't really have to do it for him. And this is also the value in a symmetrical structure, which you saw it started out as, of breaking the symmetry as soon as you can in the smartest sort of way that you can, and creating weaknesses for your opponent to have to defend against in order to create a better attack later on. Now, the first two games we looked at were a little less mainline, and this game is probably the most mainline type of game that we'll look at, but there are some opening traps even way further on into the opening that it's really good to be aware of, especially at these levels, where your opponent mostly knows the theory, but might not know it as far as you do. So we have typical London stuff here. Bishop comes out. And one thing I started to do around this level, maybe it's a little earlier, but instead of rocking this bishop back, I actually opted to jump this knight into the center right away. This is a move that can bring your opponent out of their comfort zone pretty early on in the game, especially if they seem like they're really playing into the main lines. It sort of can often transpose into those main lines, but you want your knight here anyway. So we continue with castles, bringing the bishop out to d3, just really mainline stuff, and now black pushes c5. And I had a few questions in the London video I made a couple weeks ago about why push this pawn to c5 instead of leaving it on c6, and that's honestly a great question, and one that I had myself up until kind of recently, honestly. There are a lot of long answers to this, but essentially the reason that you typically want to push c5 as black in d4 system setups is that you want to immediately strike at white center, and this also just opens up more possibilities for black to do multiple things. So for example, black could now bring the queen out to b6, and as we talked about in the previous example, actually push this pawn, force the queen trade, and go into that doubled b pawn line. Black can very simply take in the center and sort of isolate the d pawn. It's not really isolated, but it's not the, perfect London structure that most players are looking for with the white pieces. And the earlier black plays this move, usually the more opportunities there are for tricks and traps that your opponent might not be aware of. If we go all the way back, black can actually play this as early as move 2. They can play it on move 1, but that's whole different lines of theory here. But just as an example, it's actually not best for white to take this pawn here because black can play here looking to capture the pawn back, and if we just very casually try and protect our pawn with the b pawn, this is terrible because black is able to bring the queen out, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook, and we're lost in the first couple of moves. And so it's kind of like in any gambit, you really have to be careful when you take that pawn as white, and as black, you really have to know what to do and how to capitalize if you're giving up that pawn, or if you play it like my opponent did later in the game, how exactly you're going to follow that up. So anyway, in the game, I moved my c pawn up to give my bishop a space to rock back. We don't want to bring the bishop back this way because it's better to be looking over at the king since it's castled already. And that is another thing black can do with this c pawn push, is just really go for the pawn storm on this side of the board. There's so many possibilities when you get your pawn to c5 as soon as possible, and usually it's not something that white's ever going to want to take because that just destroys the whole integrity, the points, the pinnacle of the London is this d4 pawn being really stable. So black brought their knight out, I brought my knight out, and again, when you jump this knight into the center of the board, you really have to be careful that you're able to get enough defenders there in time because black can pretty quickly pile on a bunch of attackers, and if you don't have a knight that's ready to go, you might be losing a pawn here. So I brought my other knight up to f3, and this is where black made a mistake that allowed me to play out this tricky, trappy line, just adding one more attacker to this d5 square, hoping to win some material on the next move. But this is a huge mistake because it undefends the h7 square. And you might be thinking, well, why does that matter? We only have the bishop attacking. Well, if we forget for a moment about our knight here, we can actually jump this other knight up, and suddenly we have two attackers and potentially a third one on the way. And if black counts, well, they have 4 attackers and white only has 2 defenders now, and makes the mistake that my opponent did by taking the knight, we can now play bishop takes h7 with check, and suddenly we have these major threats that are really difficult to defend against. All the way back here, the best move is actually for black to just bring the knight back just to prevent any shenanigans over on the h7 square. But going back, we take on h7, and black has only one move to move the king. And now the best move actually here is to take with the pawn just to get this knight out of here. But at this point, honestly, I don't think I was really sure exactly what the follow-up here was. I just knew that this position was really good for me. I brought the queen out, which chess.com is calling a mistake, but it's very difficult for black to find the exact move here to defend everything, which is knight g4. And white is only +1 here, and the reason is that the plan for white is, of course, to move the bishop somewhere and give this check and give a mate, but because this knight is here, it can now jump and block the check from the queen. But we can, of course, just take, and then we'll just be simply up a pawn. In the game, my opponent moved the knight, desperately giving this check, but I'm able to bring the bishop back, capturing the knight and also giving a check, which it's now just mate in 1 after the king moves, and I can give checkmate right there. So this is just another fun line to be aware of. As you can see, good players can still fall into these kinds of tricks, and it's really good just to be aware of these general kind of ideas of, okay, when this knight goes away from protecting the h7 square, you know, then that's something we can think about. Okay, does this knight move actually work, or are we actually going to be losing material? But if you know the possibility is there, then it makes it a lot easier to spot in an actual game. And that brings us to our final game. This is the game that was featured in my 0 to 2000 video, in that pinnacle moment where I finally reached 2000 in chess.com rapid games for the first time. Let's take a look at it. So we start off again with very mainline London stuff, and in fact, it's pretty much identical to the last game, I believe, with this knight coming up to d5 right away. My opponent developed their other knight to d7, and it's worth noting that this knight cannot take because we can actually capture with the pawn, forking the bishop and the knight. I bring my knight out, but if black were to capture with the bishop, it's also good to capture with this pawn because this knight really has nowhere to go. It's being blocked by its friend over here on this square. It could go back to its home base, which is actually the best move, funnily enough, but it can't go anywhere along this diagonal because the queen is blocking it. And if it goes here, once this knight is here, we can take and take, or we can push and force black to take, but essentially they're just moving their knight too many times, and they're either going to end up with doubled pawns or just a very weak king side. So my opponent actually did jump their knight into the center willingly. I brought my bishop out to the square where it normally develops, and this is also double attacking the knight. I think there's a couple natural moves here for black, either bringing the knight out here, they can capture now with the bishop. There's a few options, but so the move my opponent played is actually f5, and in some cases this can work. We talked earlier about how this f-pawn push is often very weakening if you're planning to castle on the king side, but it's even more weakening if your king's not castled at all and it's still sitting in the center of the board with a nice juicy diagonal over here. And so I thought for about 30 seconds here before I played the seemingly obvious queen check. Black pushed the g-pawn, basically the only move to block, but now we can actually just take it, and if black takes, we will win the rook. What I was calculating all the way back here before playing this check is if after I gave the check and black blocked and I took, if this knight moved back would actually cause me to be losing a knight, but I figured, well, I can go all the way back here, and I just don't think black has anything there. Of course, in hindsight, this seems very simple, very easy tactic to find, but you know, when you're playing a game, especially one that's potentially going to help you reach the goal that you've had for almost a year, it's a little bit more pressure, and so I wanted to make sure I was seeing everything and not missing any very simple, you know, counterattacks that black might have. So I gave the queen check, black blocked with the pawn, I took, and now instead of losing the rook to the knight, black decided to move their rook, but this is actually a bigger mistake because now anywhere I move this knight, it will be a check on the king, and black's just going to be losing even more material. So I did end up giving this discovered check. I moved my knight back, and now the only move for black to survive here is actually to just give up the rook here on g6, and it's +4 for white because after takes and takes and takes, I mean, this is just miserable to play. We're up so much material, and we have this raging attack going against the very unsafe king. But instead of that, my opponent took about 2 seconds, made this king move, and suddenly, protected by the knight, I'm able to bring my queen up and give checkmate. And absolutely no shade to my opponent. I mean, this has happened to all of us. We get a little bit too aggressive, or, you know, we're playing on tilts, we're really nervous because it's a milestone game, or, you know, whatever the case may be, and we just blunder something silly. It doesn't matter how good you are at chess, it happens. The key, of course, is to learn from your mistakes, learn from your opponent's mistakes, and hopefully just continue to improve and play better chess every single time you sit down to play. I hope you enjoyed the insights into my thought process playing the London at these multiple different levels. Moving forward, I probably will still play the London, but I'm also looking into expanding my opening repertoire just to get some experience in different kinds of positions. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.